Let's take a look at the following Dickinson poem. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee. And reverie. The reverie alone will do, if bees are few. Dickinson's syllabic structure here is bizarre at the beginning, 13 and 6 syllables, but ends in a traditional way. So the poem formulates as do the speaker's opinions about what it takes to make a prairie. The rhyme scheme is simple, a triplet and a couplet. This break from A to B is a break between thoughts and a conclusion. Prairies did not exist in Dickinson's home state, Massachusetts, and the poem was written when the region of the country with prairies was the frontier. Consider significant imagery: sweeping plains, vastness, and rippling golden expanses. While prairies did not exist in Massachusetts, clovers very much did. It's likely Dickinson chose the clover as her model here because of how well it illustrates the relationship between plants and bees, and due to its proclivity to multiply. We also know that Dickinson had an affection for clovers and various other gardenly things. She mentions it again in her poem Purple Clover. Without going into too much detail on this other poem, notice that she again mentions the significance of the bee in the first line and the diffusion or spreading of the purple democrat. The bee, of course, is the great pollinator and the instigator of growth. Dickinson loves the bee, who makes appearances in plenty of her other poems, with dozens of references across her collected works. The bee may be yet another example of industriousness and pressing one's limits. Without the bee, the clover would wither and die. With the bee, and her apparent taste for clover, the plant can spread beyond its current geography, an image that might have appealed to Dickinson, who speaks regularly of isolation, confinement, and boundaries. This comes as no surprise when we account for the fact that Dickinson wrote often from the confines of her home, from her bedroom. We also know that she was inspired by the thoughts of the outside world, and through a love of her garden. As we'll see, the clover and the bee both represent this imagination. Of course, like Dickinson's other poems, this one could be about death. The argument is weak, but prairie madness caused by isolation and harsh conditions increased risk of suicide among those who attempted to brave the Great Plains. But this isn't supported by the rest of the poem, and there's a better case to be made here. Looking back at the text, line 3 starts a separate sentence. The speaker changes her mind and adds that reverie is also necessary for making a prairie. The question then becomes, whose reverie is required? Does the bee need imagination to pollinate the clover? Do we need to imagine a prairie for the bee to be successful? Thankfully for us, the speaker clarifies. In the next lines, she tells us that reverie alone will do, if bees are few. This presents us with a new argument, namely either a prairie needs a bee and a clover, or it needs reverie. Dickinson is really commenting on the human mind, something we know she had an interest in. How do we know? We know the Dickinsons were avid readers. In an 1862 letter to T.W. Higginson, Dickinson wrote that she owned a copy of Sir Thomas Browne. This book is a 2-volume set entitled Lectures on the Philosophy of the Human Mind, and includes lectures on both George Berkeley and David Hume. So what do Berkeley and Hume have to do with a Dickinson poem about bees and prairies? The answer is a surprising lot. In short, George Berkeley says, "A thing exists if God conceives of it." In this case, Berkeley might say that reverie of God can bring a prairie into existence. God can also think into existence a necessary relationship between clovers and bees. Hume expands on Berkeley and discusses the mind, arguing that notions of one thing allow us to make notions of another. Senses and experiences make memories, and we can combine memories in the mind's eye. That's what we call imagination. Hume would say Dickinson combines understandings from her garden to make an imaginary frontier prairie. And that's exactly what Dickinson is doing here. She takes what she knows about bees and clovers, and what she has likely heard and read about the frontier, and imagines a prairie. More likely, Dickinson believes that an imagined prairie is just as good as a real prairie. Either bees can create prairies by pollination, or we can create them in our imaginations. Even better, a prairie is perhaps an excellent example of this, since both prairies and the imagination appear to go on forever. Looking back at the guts of the poem, we see a lack of dashes. Dickinson doesn't break this poem up the same way she does others. This is not a flowing stream of ideas. This is a series of concepts. We look at what she's saying in a logical and rigid way. Interesting given the fact that the poem is about the apparent opposite, imagination. Dickinson does a lot to tease out an image here that creates a sort of circle of thought. We can observe bees and clovers, and know about prairies, which gives us thoughts about prairies, which reminds us about bees and clovers that we have observed, and so on. Then, in much the same way, thoughts about prairies make prairies, which makes the frontier, presenting expanses and a lack of limits, feeding our imagination, where we got thoughts about prairies. And she does all of this in 5 lines. Not to mention the fact that prairie may be a pun on the word prayer. In short, this is one of Dickinson's shorter poems, but jam-packed with meaning, an excellent example of a context poem and a tasty morsel for anyone with philosophical inclinations.